Good Shabbos again, everyone. As many of you know, we are very blessed at Beth Yeshurun to have an extraordinary inclusion committee. And the inclusion committee at Beth Yeshurun has been part of our congregation for the last 10 years. And in those years, they have allowed us to be even more inclusive of people throughout the Jewish community. This committee has brought us a low-sensory Purim carnival, a low-sensory Rosh Hashanah afternoon service, a welcome cart that has items that can be used by those who need to pray, a magnifying glass or something for their hearing, or something to make their prayer experience more meaningful. And it's found outside our sanctuaries. They brought us the award-winning Gathering Place program, where some of our older congregates can come and enjoy an afternoon. Otherwise, they would never have an opportunity to get out because of the conditions that they're experiencing. And of course, tonight, our annual Inclusion Shabbat. The Inclusion Committee has allowed us here at Beth Yeshurun to proudly say to the Jewish world around us that all of our places of worship, our places of work, our schools, we need to do even more. We should always be looking for ways to make all members of our community welcome, no matter who they are, no matter where they come from. They should feel they have an equal place here in places like Beth Yeshurun. I want to thank members of that committee that have allowed us to share God's word and God's message, that all Jews and all people are truly created in the image of God. I want to thank our Inclusion Committee Chair, Richard Kammerman. Where's Richard? Richard, if you'll stand for just a moment. It's Richard who's really brought this committee to life and has really led this committee for the last 10 years. And I want to welcome his new co-chair, Rachel Zuckman. Rachel, if you'll rise, please, as well. And now continuing this year, Richard and Rachel will work together. And I want to ask all the members of the Inclusion Committee to please rise so we can thank you for all of your hard work. This, of course, is our 10th year where we've had this special Shabbat. And it's another way to create an awareness within our Beth Yeshurun and Houston community of the needs of those with disabilities, including the need for all of us to be more respectful, more understanding, and more sensitive to their needs. It's an evening where our congregation restates and reaffirms our commitment to welcoming everyone. We welcome all those who are guests with us this evening, and to let you know you're always welcome at Congregation Beth Yeshurun. Every year, as part of our Inclusion Shabbat, we honor a group or an individual who shares our mission of being more inclusive. And this year, it's our honor to focus on the silent disability that many of us suffer, trauma and mental illness. So this year's honorees are the trauma staff of Jewish Family Service. They are truly a beacon of light for families and individuals who are dealing with issues such as stress, interpersonal conflicts, depression, bereavement, post-traumatic stress, or anger management. The Jewish Family Service counseling staff offers accessible, expert counseling services and programs that support mental, emotional, and social well-being. And their licensed and certified professional staff excel in their fields and offer help to people from all parts of community. I have seen the real and positive difference they have made for so many who are in need. And I'm often very thankful as a rabbi that I have a place to turn to for guidance when myself or my colleagues are helping those in need. And that we, along with rabbis throughout this community, have a place where we can refer people to and have full confidence that they'll get the help that they need. This evening, I want to thank Dr. Ada Chung, who's the head of the trauma staff at the Jewish Family Service. And along with all the therapists who are at Jewish Family Service, I'd like all those therapists to rise, along with Dr. Chung. And again, let us thank you for all the work that you do. And finally, it's always a pleasure to recognize our friend, Linda Berger, who's the CEO of Jewish Family Service, whose leadership and diligent efforts have led to the creation and implementation of this wonderful counseling services department. Linda, thank you for all that you do for our community. So now it's my pleasure to call upon Rachel Zuckman, who will introduce our speaker this evening.
Hi, guys. Please forgive me. The speech pathologist has lost her voice, so I'm going to do the best I can. All right, it is my pleasure to introduce Marissa Novitz. She received her bachelor's degree in psychology from Texas A&M and her master's degree in social work from the University of Houston. Now a licensed social worker with over 17 years of clinical experience with expertise in program planning, professional training for mental health clinicians, healthcare providers, educators, and caregivers. Marissa serves as the Assistant Director of School and Community Programs for the Trauma and Grief Center at Texas Children's University, where she oversees evidence-based trauma and bereavement-focused services in the community, focusing on Santa Fe High School, or for Santa Fe, the Santa Fe, Texas, in the wake of the tragic shooting in May of 2018. In addition, Marissa manages and provides school and community-based trainings for the Trauma and Grief Center in the areas of children's trauma and grief, trauma and bereavement, and informing organizations and schools, as well as secondary traumatic stress and self-care. She has extensive experience and expertise in utilizing evidence-based assessments and interventions with children and families who have experienced mass violence at school, as well as those who have experienced other traumas or losses. So without further ado, Marissa, I hand over that podium.
Good evening, everybody. Richard told me I was supposed to do this without notes, but I'm sorry, Richard, I have to have my notes. So I'm really honored to be here tonight to be speaking to you about this really meaningful topic of inclusion. I know this is something that the community has been focusing on. There's so many events happening these past couple of weeks. And thinking about the message that I was going to share with you tonight, I wondered what I could say that past presenters haven't already said. So what could CEOs, renowned authors, community leaders, Paralympians even, and other inspiring individuals already not have covered? In the past, this discussion has really focused on thinking about including those with physical disabilities and the importance of that. Tonight, as was mentioned, I'm going to focus on the importance of including those who are experiencing more invisible differences, so emotional or psychological ones rather than the physical ones. I really prefer to use the word differences to disability because the word disability inherently implies that someone is less than another person, that those of us without disabilities are able-bodied. Each one of us has a brain and a body that functions differently, and a brain and body with less function isn't better or worse than a brain or body with more function, it's just different. So tonight I'm going to share a little about the work that we do at the Trauma and Grief Center with those who may have invisible differences, and I'm also going to share some of my own story in the hopes it gets you thinking about your own personal story and how that's helped shape your view of others and of the world. My 3-year-old son is very uninterested in my speech right now, so, okay. One of the fundamental tenets of Judaism is being inclusive of others and supporting those less fortunate than us, those who might be different from us. After all, aren't we all different from each other? As the extraordinary Mr. Rogers once said, as human beings, our job in life is to help people realize how rare and valuable each one of us really is, that each of us has something that no one else has or ever will have, something inside that is unique to all time. It's our job to encourage each other to discover that uniqueness and to provide ways of developing its expression. Tonight, we focus on the importance of being inclusive of those with differences we can't see, specifically those who've experienced trauma and/or grief. There are many other types of differences which people harbor beneath their physical exterior. Mental illness, intellectual and developmental differences, and trauma are just a few. In order to be sensitive to those who have these experiences, it's really important to have a basic understanding of how these experiences impact individuals. Trauma is a silent epidemic, which is really gaining increased awareness since becoming more prevalent in our society. It can be defined as witnessing or experiencing an event that overwhelms a person's capacity to cope. It's really a subjective experience. It's based on the person's own interpretation of how they experience that event. This can include a one-time event, so for those of us who are impacted by Harvey and flooding, this could be a car accident, other events like that, or it can be more chronic and ongoing experiences. Trauma reactions, or our emotional and psychological response to a traumatic event, are really individualized. Two people can experience the same traumatic event, have the same experience, but they're going to have different traumatic stress reactions based on a variety of different factors. These reactions can range from feeling hypervigilant, so for instance, anytime it rains, for those who are impacted by flooding, feeling very distressed when it rains, to also having a negative mood, to wanting to avoid at all costs anything that reminds the person of the traumatic experience. One type of trauma specific is bereavement, which according to UNICEF is also the most commonly experienced type of trauma and the most distressing form of trauma worldwide. We often use the terms bereavement and grief interchangeably, but they really have different meanings. Bereavement is the experience of loss by death, while grief is our emotional or psychological reaction to that loss. So just like with trauma, two people can experience the same loss, the same bereavement experience, but they're going to have different grief reactions based on a variety of factors. The loss of a loved one is a universal experience. Bereavement and subsequent grief do not discriminate based on culture, socioeconomic status, ethnicity, gender, sexual orientation, or age. We all have or will have experienced bereavement at some point in our lives. I'd like to share a little about the work we're doing at the Trauma and Grief Center at Texas Children's Hospital. Under the direction of the incomparable Julie Kaplow, who's also a member of Beth Yeshurun and is here tonight, which is why I threw in the incomparable part, the Trauma and Grief, or TAG Center, provides evidence-based services to children of all ages who've experienced any kind of trauma and or the death of a loved one. One of the many initiatives of the TAG Center has been to provide trauma and grief-focused support in Santa Fe, Texas, following the tragic school shooting in May of 2018. In my role at TAG, I've had the distinct honor of working alongside many skilled clinicians to provide services to this resilient community. But their stories of trauma and grief are not mine to tell. My own grief story and how I got into this work started when I was 7 years old. My mom, who was in her 30s at the time, was diagnosed with multiple sclerosis. My younger brother was 3, and at the time, her new diagnosis wasn't something I remember being significantly impactful for our family, although I'm sure it was for her. I remember knowing my mom had MS, but not truly feeling the impact of her illness until I reached middle school. At that time, I attended the same middle school where my mom was a beloved 6th grade math teacher, and the physical effects of her illness became more and more visible over time. I started to react in a way most teenagers would react to having a mom in a wheelchair, which was to harbor a lot of internal embarrassment. Of course, at the time, I didn't realize this was actually a developmentally appropriate response to having a parent with a physical difference. My mom's illness slowly worsened throughout my teenage years and early 20s, and a month before my 28th birthday, my mom became ill and required hospitalization. After a lengthy hospital stay and many complications, my mom was transferred to hospice, where she died peacefully and with dignity on her own terms, with her family by her side. And because the day wasn't hard enough for me already as a single 27-year-old woman, she died on Valentine's Day. While I always knew my mom would likely not live until old age because of her illness, I wouldn't exactly say I was prepared for this loss. I had lost 3 of my 4 grandparents as a teenager, so it wasn't my first experience with grief, but it was certainly my first experience with this type of grief. I was working as a medical social worker at the hospital where my mom had spent the last few weeks of her life, and I wasn't quite sure how I would return back there. It was filled with trauma and loss reminders. Loss reminders are things that we experience through our 5 senses, things we can taste, see, smell, hear, or maybe people or events that remind us that the person we love is gone. These reminders can be distressing, but they can also be really comforting. For instance, for some, looking at a picture of your loved one might be a comforting reminder that helps you feel connected to that person. But for others, that might be a distressing reminder of their loss. Trauma reminders are similar, But these remind us of how the person died or of the traumatic event itself and are always distressing. For me, the hospital was a significant loss and trauma reminder of my mom's absence and how she died. Valentine's Day was another loss reminder. I'm going to come back to this in a minute. Luckily for me, exactly 1 week after my mom died, I was offered a job at another hospital I had interviewed for months earlier. This was a job I had been wanting for many years. Call it a coincidence, I call it my mom. I started my new job as a social worker at MD Anderson, working closely with adult oncology patients and their families. It became clear to me very early on that if I was to help patients and families cope with their illnesses, I needed to take care of myself emotionally. I started going to therapy to be able to process my grief experience. I loved my job and the work I was doing, but something was missing. I always knew I wanted to work with kids, and all of my training had been focused on helping kids who were sick or abused. But after my mom died, it suddenly became clear to me that what I was passionate about was helping other kids whose parents were sick. I remembered how it felt as a child watching my mom struggle with being tired all the time, how different I felt having a mom in a wheelchair. I wanted to be able to help children cope with the developmental disruptions these experiences can cause, as well as to help parents understand the best ways to talk with their children about illness. With the help of extremely supportive leadership and colleagues, we were able to launch a support program at MD Anderson for children whose parents have cancer. 13 years later, the program is still going strong. Aside from my children, this program is one of my proudest legacies. But my grief story doesn't end there. 7 months after my mom died in September of 2006, I received another life-changing call. It was Erev Rosh Hashanah when I got the call from an unknown number. The call was from an ER nurse who told me that my dad had been brought into the hospital and had died suddenly from a previously unknown medical complication. This was obviously a different experience than my mom, who died peacefully and on her own terms. This one for me was much more traumatic due to many different circumstances surrounding my dad's death. Now 28, and yes, still single, I was suddenly also parentless. I struggled with many of those existential questions like, who am I now? Can I still be a daughter if I don't have parents? I know I'm a sister, but who am I? I again utilized therapy to try and process these questions in addition to the traumatic circumstances surrounding my dad's sudden death. I remember at that point feeling not only like I viewed the world differently, but like the world viewed me differently. Like very well-meaning, supportive friends and family looked at me differently. Not because they intended to, but because I was different. My experiences were different from those of my peers, and no one could really relate. Most of my friends were married, having children, and couldn't understand what it was like to be dealing with estates and wills and cleaning out my childhood home. I felt very isolated. Grief can do that to you. Luckily for me, my support system was extremely inclusive of my brother and me during this time. Which brings me back to the importance of being inclusive to those who have different experiences than we do. Imagine encountering me at the grocery store after losing my parents, and it's late January when all of the Valentine's decorations are going up. This grocery store was a particularly distressing place for me at that time because Valentine's Day was a significant loss reminder that my mom had died. Whenever I'd see the decorations, I would get physically nauseous. So there I am at the grocery store trying to calm myself down without making a scene, and imagine if you had bumped into me with your grocery cart. At that particular moment, I probably wouldn't have been the most pleasant person to interact with, and you wouldn't have known why. You would have just said, "What's wrong with that lady?" Which is what we all do when we can't see people's invisible wounds. Now imagine running into me at synagogue during the high holidays. My dad used to usher at the temple where I grew up, and he died right before Rosh Hashanah, so that's his yard site. Being at the synagogue where he used to usher around the time of year he died is a little both comforting and upsetting loss reminder for me. Imagine seeing me there and I look upset. Maybe I don't want to talk or socialize. Maybe I'm crying, and you're thinking, what's wrong with her? Not realizing that inside I'm trying to cope with all the many reminders that come with that situation. Synagogue can be full of loss reminders to those of us who are grieving. It's where we spend holidays with our family. This is also where we mourn the loss of our loved ones, not only immediately following the death, but every year during the holidays and every year on their yard site. This is where we interact with the rabbis and others who support us during the most vulnerable times in our lives. I bring up these reminders because recognizing their impact on those who are grieving is an important component to being inclusive of those who have experienced a loss. It's not only important to be inclusive of people in synagogue, but in our daily lives. I work with a lot of schools and organizations to become more trauma and grief informed or trauma and grief sensitive. And the easiest way to start to do this is to no longer ask what's wrong with you, but what's happened to you. Many times we may not know the answer to that question, and that's okay. We don't need to know everyone's story. Just know that everyone has a story. We can view people's behaviors as automatic responses to their experiences. By reframing this simple question, it allows us to start looking at people with greater compassion and understanding that we all have stories to tell. After my dad died, I was even more driven to help kids who were struggling with a parent's illness, as well as those who were grieving. That's the thing about grief, trauma, and those other invisible wounds. There is healing and growth to be found in our most difficult moments. Now, Valentine's Day is a day where we honor and celebrate my mom and her legacy. I incorporate some of the same traditions my mom did when we were kids for my own children. The years went by after I lost my parents, and life brought on all the changes that come with it. Thankfully, to my family's happiness, I met a husband. We had 2 beautiful children, and my professional goals began to evolve. What I like to think of as fate, or again, maybe my parents, led me one day to Dr. Kaplow. We chatted about her work and the services her Trauma and Grief Center provided to children. I was pregnant at the time, and I wasn't really looking for a new job. But fast forward 6 months, when one day I decided really rather randomly that I needed to send her my resume. There was no job posted. I just felt like the time was right. I always say that after 9 months of some healthy stalking on my part, she finally offered me the job. Through this opportunity, I've been able to experience some of my most profound professional moments to date. Working with an entire community who experienced mass violence has made it increasingly clear how vital it is for us as a community to become aware of our own judgments and internal biases towards others. How we view others is a reflection of how we view ourselves. If we can view our own stories, our own struggles, and our own differences through a lens of kindness and compassion, then it will be easier to do the same for others. Positive relationships, those connections we make with other individuals, those are what provide the foundation from which we can grow and heal from our circumstances. Together, we can provide a safe, nurturing, and inclusive community for all to feel welcome to celebrate our differences and personal experiences. I'd like to leave you with one last quote from the great Mr. Rogers, which I hope resonates with all of us as members of the Jewish community. All of us at some time or other need help. Whether we're giving or receiving help, each one of us has something valuable to bring to this world. That's one of the things that connects us as neighbors. In our own way, each one of us is a giver and a receiver. Thank you, and Shabbat Shalom.
Yasher Koach. I am also done with the honor of handing you your certificate. This comes from the Inclusion Committee. It's signed by Richard Kimmerman, myself, and Rabbi Strauss for sharing in our 10th anniversary celebration of Jewish Disability Awareness and Inclusion Month and speaking on adversity, trauma, and hope. I greatly appreciate it.
You'll find the lyrics for this beautiful song in your Shabbat bulletin. And this is dedicated to all our beloved Beth Yeshurun members who are struggling with ill health and adversity. We want you to know we are all here for you. When you walk through a storm, hold your head up high. And don't be afraid of the dark. At the end of a storm, there's a golden sky and the sweet silver song of a lark. Walk on through the wind, walk on through the rain. tossed and blown. Walk on with hope in your heart, and you'll never walk alone. You'll never walk alone. Walk on.